Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Lunch and Learn for Safety Forward. This month, it's going to be on COSHH, the basics, the storage, use, and disposal of hazardous substances. We've based this on a mixed workplace group using examples, such as cleaning products, solvents, and aerosols, just as and dusts produced from processes. So please just note that obviously this doesn't replace formal COSHH training. However, this is just a bit of awareness for you all on what's kind of expected, and all the information we've got is based off HSE guidance. Please note also as well that COSHH requirements in Great Britain and Northern Ireland are similar in purpose, but they're slightly different, and the rules differ by local and national arrangements. Okay, so what we'll cover in this next 20 minutes is to recognise the hazard, control the exposure, and close the loop safely of COSHH. So we need to know how to spot it, to know what counts as COSHH, what counts as substance, what comes under the COSHH regulations, how we should store it, where we should keep it, what we shouldn't keep near it, what we should consider when storing COSHH. When we're using it, what controls we should use, what controls should be in place, PPE, ventilation, hygiene, obviously washing your hands after using COSHH, and the disposal of it, so the separation of the waste and authorised collection, and how, what we can dispose of normally, what we need specialist supervision to dispose of. So just remember, COSHH is about preventing or controlling the exposure, not simply keeping a folder of paperwork. So what counts as a COSHH good? So COSHH covers chemicals and products but also substances created by the work, such as dusts and fumes. So people, when they're using, for example, welding, when they're sanding, anything like that, that all comes under COSHH. Just be aware that when you are using COSHH goods that do have dust and fumes, the dust and fumes must be included in that assessment to cover it. So, for example, if you're using goods that when you're sanding paintwork or metalwork and it produces, for example, aluminium dioxide, things like that, that should all also be considered under the assessment. So when we're thinking about what counts as a COSHH good, so you've got any product that contains chemicals. So, for example, even down to your cleaning chemicals, when you're down to, bleaches, anything like that, all the way up to oxidizers, to biological agents and germs, things like that come under it. Substances produced by a task. So any task that you undertake that can produce any kind of mists or gases, fumes or vapors, they all come under COSHH. So just some quick examples for you are cleaning chemicals, oils, solvents, adhesives, aerosols, wood dust, and welding fumes. So the HSE COSHH guidance states that hazards are not limited to substances labelled hazardous. Harmful substances can be produced by processes. So what should we do? So the employer, as an employer, what must we do? So we must assess, prevent or control exposure and maintain the controls and train people on how to use the goods. So we must assess to identify the hazards, how people may be exposed and what controls we need. This can be done through COSHH assessments, and using MSDSs that are provided with the goods. We must control, so we must prevent exposure where practicable, otherwise reduce exposure to an adequate limit. This is where you have exposure limits in place, and that's where you'll find those on the MSDS, the Material Safety Data Sheet, or on the COSHH assessment produced from the MSDS. Once we've got the controls in place, we must maintain them. We must keep the control measures working, making sure that they're still, they are working. Examine and test equipment where required to make sure that stays in full working order, such as your extraction, your fume cabinets, anything as such to that's in place to remove the fumes or any exposure to the chemicals. Inform and train. So we've got to explain the hazards controls. It's no use just having a COSHH assessment written and then not doing anything with it, putting it in a folder and keeping it there. We need to use that to train people adequately, to explain the hazards, explain what PPE they need, explain the first aid measures, the emergency action to take place, and also to access any kind of safety data that we need. And then prepare. So we've got to plan arrangements for accidents, incidents, and emergencies involving COSHH. So this includes, ingestion, inhalation of the chemicals, any spills, anything as such, all comes under, we have to have emergency plans in place for all of those. Okay, so for workers, they must use controls correctly, follow the assessment and instructions given, report any damages to any equipment that's used to control, and any spillage, report any spillages or anything that allows the release of the chemicals, and ask if they're unsure that the process is safe. No. Also, please just be aware that if the product quantity or location of the goods changes, then the COSHH assessment that you've got in place may no longer be fit for the product. So it needs to be updated, reviewed, and changed to make sure it actually truly reflects the amount of goods that we're storing on site. So, labels and safety data sheets. So the labels and the safety data sheets are your first port of call to understand what the chemical is, what the hazards are associated with it. So when you're looking at a product label, what you should look for on that label is the hazard symbols and the signal words that are associated with that chemical, the precautionary statements and the hazard statements associated with it, the first aid and storage hints. So they will give you a quick brief guidance on, what first aid you would need for it, and what first aid measures, you would need for it, and where is suitable storage, and the supplier details and batch info. Because without the supplier details and batch info, we don't know who's made the chemical. We've got no traceability. And with COSHH, you have to have traceability. It's a key part of the COSHH regulations. So to find on the SDS sections, you can check section 2 for the hazards that are associated with the goods. Section 7 will always have handling and storage of the goods. So what PPE you need, what's a safe location to hold them, what PPE you need when handling the goods, and any safe locations for them. Section 8 for exposure controls and PPE, section 13 for disposal, and sections 4 and 5 for the first aid measures and appropriate fire safety measures. However, once you've used your MSDS to create a COSHH assessment, the COSHH assessment will contain all of this information as well, and it will show it in relevance, in reflection of the site and how much is actually stored on the site. Okay, so just a quick five practical questions to ask when you're working with COSHH goods is: 1, what's the substance? What is it? What am I working with? What is this chemical? 2, who could be exposed to it? So, is it going to be just the employees working with the chemical, or could it be other persons working in that environment as well that can be affected to it? Because quite often the PPE, if you need RPE, respiratory protective equipment, for the person working with it, you may need it for anybody else working in that environment if they're in an enclosed area and the exposure limit exceeds what's allowed, what's permitted. So 3, how can it enter the body? Can it enter through absorption, through cuts? Can it be inhaled? Can it go in, be put in through the eyes? Anything like this can all be, how can it enter your body? These all must be considered. 4, what controls do we require to protect people from the chemical? What controls, what extraction, what PPE, anything as such, what do we need to put in place to protect people from the chemical? And question 5 is, what do we do if something goes wrong? Have we got an emergency plan in place? Is there a stop process? Is there a stop work process in place if there's a spillage, if there's anything that gets into the environment? And is there anything in place that we can put in a plan to make sure that it's done safely and there's a process to follow if something goes wrong? So just be aware as well, if there's no COSHH assessment in place, it shouldn't be used within your business until there is a suitable COSHH assessment in place. Just be aware as well that COSHH assessments must be created off an MSDS that's no more than 3 years old. So if the MSDS is more than 3 years old, you should be requesting a more up-to-date one from the supplier of your goods. If they can't provide you with one, then I would recommend looking for a new supplier of those goods if possible. So always, like we said, remember, if there's a change in task, product, quantity, or location, the assessment must be updated. So, good storage prevents exposure before work starts. So storage is part of the risk control, not just housekeeping. So we must secure controlled areas access. So, no unauthorized use or removal of the goods from a specific area if it's designated. no unauthorised persons entering that area if they're not required to. We need to restrict access to the areas when we're working with some serious chemicals, and make sure that as fewer people are exposed to them as possible. They must be labelled. Quite often what I see when I'm going around in a lot of areas is COSHH goods put into a clear container with no label on it, and nobody knows what's actually in there. This can be really hazardous. It can be a real big problem. If we don't know what's in there, we don't know how to dispose of it. We don't know what the hazards associated with it are. We don't know what can be done with it, what we can use it for or not. Quite often it can get mixed up with other fluids and other liquids and other chemicals before we know it, you've got a real serious issue on your hands. So is it suitably contained? Are any lids closed if possible? If dispensing goods, are they stored on drip trays or bunds? You'll see quite often oil drums on big trays with a catch system in underneath. If we're dispensing COSHH goods internally or externally, they typically should be stored on one of those to avoid it getting on the floor, getting into the environment. If you're working with oils and it goes on the floor, it can create slip hazards. This is what we want to try and avoid. So drip trays and bunds are a must-have for any dispensing goods. So ventilation. So to avoid vapor builds up, you've got to follow the MSDS storage section. It'll explain to you what kind of ventilation is needed. Is there a need for mechanical ventilation, or is natural ventilation suitable? It will all be explained in the MSDS. This information will then be transferred into the COSHH assessment as well when you create your COSHH assessment. So once again, make sure that once we've created the COSHH assessment, we communicate all that information over to all the employees that are relevant working in that area. And then also minimum. So keep only what the work needs, rotate the stock as well. First in, first out kind of system is required with the COSHH goods, so that we're not keeping them for too long. And also, we don't need, if we're only using 1 litre a day of a chemical, we don't need to have 1,000 litres of it stored on site. It may work out cheaper. However, the hazards associated increase significantly. So when we're working with COSHH goods, we only really want to keep what we need on site. So we don't want to have a massive build-up or a backlog of goods because you're just keeping them there for the sake of it. We want to make sure that we minimise what we're keeping on site. It should always be relevant to the amount that's used. Okay, so segregate incompatibles and keep stock under control. So the MSDS should tell you what should not be stored together. Here's just some examples. This isn't an exhaustive list. This is just a little bit of an example for you. So, for example, flammables, we want to keep them away from ignition sources and oxidizers. If you have flammables stored in a place with oxidizers and a source of ignition, you've got a self-sustaining fire there. The oxidizer will just keep fueling the fire. The flammables will keep the fire burning, and it's going to be a real big problem. So we want to make sure that we keep them clear of any oxidizers or ignition sources. Why it matters is, fire and rapid spread of fire. The storage conditions should be approved cabinets for small quantities, and larger cabinets typically for larger quantities, depending on the flammable good. It's not exclusively that you have to keep them exclusively in a cabinet, but there are other means available. However, that would be relative to what you're storing and how much of it you're storing. For acids, they must be kept clear of alkalis and some metals for the heat, the fumes and splashes. So they should be stored in separate trays and separate shelves away from each other. They shouldn't be kept in the same cupboard together usually. So once again, oxidizers should be kept away from flammables and organics, as it will intensify the fire. Oxidizers would typically be stored in their own dedicated area. That's what we'd like to see. And aerosols should be kept away from heat and impact for the hazard of burst and release. They should be stored in a cool area, upright and secured. So once again, this is just a prompt. So always follow the material safety data sheet regarding the chemicals that you're using. Always try to keep containers closed where possible and remove any expired or damaged stock through the proper route of removal. So before, during and after the task. So before the task, you should read the COSHH assessment, check the label and MSDS, confirm the controls and PPE that are in place are adequate, and inspect containers and the area around the containers to make sure there's nothing in there that shouldn't be in there. So during the process, you should use the smallest amount possible, keep the lids closed, use any LEVs, ventilation or extraction that's provided, and try and avoid any skin contact and inhalation where possible. Also, if you have any open cuts, we want to avoid absorption through the open cuts as well. And after, we want to make sure the working area has been adequately cleaned, close and return the stock to its designated area, remove the PPE correctly, and wash hands and report any issues that were found. As a golden rule, we do not mix any products unless the assessment explicitly says it's safe to do so. So PPE is important, but it's not the first control. So COSHH starts with eliminating or reducing exposure at its source. Here's what we have. We have the hierarchy of a hierarchy of control. To eliminate or substitute would be your first route of cause. Can the task be avoided? Can it be replaced with a safer one? Can it be a safer chemical used? Can there be any other way of achieving the same results? Change or enclose the process, so reduce vapors, dust, mist, or contact by design. Any engineering controls, can we use LEV, containment, guards, or dosing systems? Safe systems of work to restrict access, train people, supervise, and clean up after. And then the last line of defense is PPE/RPE. With PPE, obviously, one thing we've got to check, which will be told in the COSHH assessment, is it the right type? Obviously, look at the person. Are they using the correct size? Is the PPE in good condition? Do we have the right removal process and the right disposal process in place for the PPE? So, spills and emergencies. Stop the exposure first. Your emergency action must match the substance, quantity, and location of goods. So, the first step would be to stop work if it's safe, and do not walk through the spill and try to isolate the spill. Keep people away, ventilate if instructed to do so by the COSHH assessment. So inform everybody, raise the alarm, and contact the named person that's responsible for the safety of this and the control of this issues. Contain using the correct spill kit only if you're trained to do so. Spill response training is critical for COSHH goods to make sure that it's contained appropriately. And clean and report. So we clean up and then make sure we dispose of any contaminated materials and record the incident. We should then be reviewing to make sure it doesn't happen the same again. COSHH goods don't just disappear when the task ends. Waste must be identified, separated, stored, and collected through the authorised route. So we must classify it as, is it hazardous waste? What code applies to this waste? Separate it and store it, so keep it secure, labelled and compatible. Use an authorised carrier to dispose of anything that requires it. That's registered. Use registered collectors. You can find them online. There are many companies that do this. A consignment note for the paperwork for the hazardous waste movements, and then keep a record of what's of these stored consignment notes and returns for the required period. So do not pour chemicals down drains unless authorised by procedure. Do not mix waste streams to save space. Do not put hazardous waste in general waste bins, and do not remove COSHH waste without approved paperwork. Many companies, they won't actually accept it on site without the correct paperwork. So from delivery, what would you check? Delivery, the label to be intact, the MSDS to be available, and the correct storage area available. Storage, is it compatible with other goods that are in the area? Is the area secured, contained, and is the quantity of stock justified? Task setup. So assessment, is the COSHH assessment current and in date, and does it reflect what is in use? And are the controls in place, and is the PPE actually available that's required? Is the ventilation working? Is the smallest amount being used? Are we avoiding mixing the chemicals? And is the waste separated, labelled, and is an authorised collector being used to dispose of it? 3 questions to take back to work. So, store, is it labelled, compatible, secure, and contained? Use, do I know the controls, PPE, ventilation, and emergency action to take? and dispose. Is the waste separated, labelled, and going through the approved route? When in doubt, stop, secure the area, and speak to your supervisor or safety lead. So, safe COSHH practice is a loop. It's assess, store, use, respond, dispose, and review. So just below are some official sources that you can use for information. So the HSE COSHH Hub and What the Law Says guidance, HSE COSHH Risk Assessment and Training guidance, HSE Safety Data Sheets guidance, gov.uk Hazardous Waste Overview, producers, holders and consignment notes, and the COSHH Regulations 2002 and COSHH Northern Ireland requirements where applicable. Wonderful. Okay, then. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for attending today. It was lovely to see you all again. Thank you for being here. If you do have any questions following on from this, please do let me know, and I can come back to you. Like I said, via email. I can send you over any information that you require. Okay. Well, I hope you all have an absolutely lovely afternoon. Thank you very much for attending, and I'll see you all soon.